7 tools. Every one of them sat in a garage or a shed or a barn somewhere in this country. Every one of them was sold at the hardware store, recommended by a neighbor, handed down from a father to a son. And every one of them killed men who knew exactly what they were doing. Number 7. The wheel hoe with an unshielded oscillating blade. Before the riding mower, before the rototiller became a rental item at the farm supply, the wheel hoe was how a man kept his kitchen garden under control. It was a single iron wheel mounted ahead of a long wooden handle with a replaceable blade assembly at the base, and you pushed it down the row between your beans and your tomatoes, and the oscillating blade cut the weeds off at the root in a single pass. Sears carried them. Montgomery Ward carried them. They were on the back page of seed catalogs beside the advertisements for pole bean varieties and cold frame kits. Every serious gardener from Maine to California owned one or knew a man who did. And on a Saturday morning in May, with the soil worked loose from a recent rain, it was as pleasant a tool as a man could ask for. The blade oscillated on a pivot. On early production models through the 1940s and into the 1950s, that pivot was unguarded, and the return stroke brought the leading edge of the blade back toward the operator's feet at ankle height, with enough force to cut through leather work boots. A man who let his stride get ahead of the push rhythm, which happened naturally when the ground softened and the tool moved faster than expected, could bring the blade across his own foot before he registered that anything had changed. Documented emergency room records from agricultural counties across the Midwest and South cataloged partial amputations of toes and the forefoot with enough regularity that the American Farm Bureau began including blade guard specifications in its recommended equipment standards by the late 1950s. The unguarded versions were not recalled. They stayed in sheds for another generation until rust or replacement retired them, and the men who used them simply learned to shorten their stride and hope the ground stayed firm. Number 6. Carbon monoxide, producing gasoline-powered cultivators used in low-clearance spaces. The walk-behind garden cultivator was one of the genuinely useful machines the post-war economy delivered to the American homeowner. A small gasoline engine, a set of rotating tines, and a man walking behind it could turn a quarter-acre kitchen garden in a morning that would have taken 2 days with a spade. They were sold at every hardware store in the country from the late 1940s onward, and the men who bought them used them hard and considered them worth every penny of what they cost. Troy-Bilt, Simplicity, Rototiller, these were names a man recognized the way he recognized the name on his pickup truck. The engine produced carbon monoxide. That is a property of any gasoline combustion engine and is not specific to the cultivator. What was specific to the cultivator was the way men used it, in low-clearance spaces, beneath grape arbors, against the foundation of a house, inside a greenhouse to get a head start on the season before the last frost, and in attached garages when the weather turned. Carbon monoxide has no odor. A man working in an enclosed space with a running cultivator had no sensory warning that the air was becoming unbreathable. Documented fatalities in residential settings involved men found beside their machines with no sign of struggle. No indication they understood what was happening. OSHA and the Consumer Product Safety Commission addressed the broader category of gasoline-powered equipment in enclosed spaces through successive rounds of labeling requirements and warning standards, none of which changed the behavior of a man who had run the same machine in the same tight space for 20 years without incident. The incident, when it arrived the same way every time. Number 5. The rotary push mower with an open rear discharge. In the early years of the rotary push mower, the 1950s and into the 1960s, the blade spun at around 3,000 rotations per minute beneath a pressed steel deck with no rear shield and no discharge guard of any meaningful design. The blade was a single piece of stamped steel approximately 18 to 21 inches long, and it turned fast enough that whatever it contacted was not cut so much as it was struck at high velocity by a steel edge moving too fast for the eye to follow. The mowers were everywhere. Every subdivision built between 1950 and 1965 had one in the garage. They were lighter than the real mowers they replaced. They handled thick grass without clogging, and a man could do his lawn in 40 minutes instead of 2 hours. The American lawn as a cultural institution and the rotary mower as its primary instrument arrived at exactly the same moment. The rear discharge threw whatever the blade contacted directly backward at the operator and anything positioned behind him. Stones, wire, buried hardware. A child's toy left in the grass, the blade did not distinguish between organic and inorganic material. It struck everything with equal force and ejected it rearward at velocities documented in CPSC testing at over 200 feet per second. Eye injuries, leg lacerations, and fatalities in bystanders, particularly children, were recorded in numbers large enough that the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute and the CPSC spent the better part of 2 decades negotiating blade contact and discharge standards that eventually became ANSI B71.1. The rear shield became mandatory. The dead man's switch became mandatory. The mowers sold before those standards existed stayed in service until they wore out, and some of them were still cutting grass in 1980 on the same original blade their owner had never thought to replace. If you have used any of the tools we have covered so far, drop the name of it in the comments below. We want to know which of these were sitting in your garage or your grandfather's shed. And if you are watching this channel for the first time, click subscribe and hit the bell. We cover the tools, the trades, and the history that most channels do not go near. Number 4. The wooden handle scythe with an untempered blade. The scythe is one of the oldest cutting tools in human history, and for most of that history it performed exactly as intended without incident, because the men who used it were taught by men who had used it, and the knowledge of how to swing it, how to stand, how to peen and stone the blade, and how to carry it without killing anyone nearby was transmitted directly and completely from one generation to the next. What happened in America through the middle of the 20th century was that the transmission broke down. The scythe became a niche item sold at farm supply stores and mail-order catalogs to men who had read about it or seen one in a magazine and wanted to clear the back acres of their property without renting equipment. The instruction that came with it was a single folded sheet. The untempered blade, the grade of blade that came attached to the low-cost versions sold through general retail channels rather than farm supply specialists, did not hold an edge. A man who could not properly stone and peen a blade, which was most of the men who bought these through retail channels because that knowledge had not been passed to them, was working with a blade that required significantly more force to cut than a properly maintained edge. More force meant a wider, more violent swing. A wider swing in rough terrain, in scrub, in the kind of dense, mixed vegetation that grows on the back 40 of a residential property that hasn't been managed in years, produced a blade path that was not predictable. Documented injuries from amateur scythe use in the post-war era included lacerations to the lower leg and ankle from the follow-through of a deflected swing. Several involved bystanders. The scythe was not banned. It was simply absorbed into the category of things that hardware stores stopped stocking because the liability attached to selling it to men with no training and a single instruction sheet was no longer worth what it contributed to the bottom line. Number 3. The unpowered rotary tiller with pinch point tine guards. The hand crank rotary tiller, not the engine-powered cultivator, but its smaller predecessor, a wheeled frame with a set of manually turned steel tines that a man rotated against the soil by pushing a crank handle, was a fixture in kitchen gardens through the 1930s and 1940s. It was a clever piece of engineering. It broke up compacted soil faster than a fork and required no fuel, no engine maintenance, and no mechanical knowledge beyond the ability to push it in a straight line. Seed catalogs sold them beside the seed packets. They were inexpensive and they worked, and the men who used them thought of them the way they thought of a good rake or a sharp hoe, as a simple tool that did a simple job. The tine guards on early production versions were stamped steel shields fixed close to the rotating tines to prevent the operator's hands from contacting them during normal use. The gap between the guard and the tine was a pinch point. Under load, when a tine caught on a root or a buried stone, and the crank handle kicked back against the operator's hand, fingers could be drawn into that gap faster than the man holding the handle could release his grip. The injury profile was consistent: crush injuries and degloving to 2 or 3 fingers on the dominant hand, almost always the index and middle fingers, almost always on the return kick from an obstruction catch. There was no regulatory action specific to the hand crank tiller because by the time anyone was paying attention to garden tool injury rates, the powered cultivator had largely replaced it, and the injury data was absorbed into the general category of hand tool accidents. The men who lost the use of their fingers in those tying guards did not file claims that went anywhere. They wrapped the hand, went back to work when they could, and did not talk about it much. Number 2. The pump-style garden sprayer with no pressure relief valve. The brass pump garden sprayer was a beautiful piece of hardware, a cylindrical tank, usually copper or brass on the quality models, with a hand pump assembly on top and a wand and nozzle at the end of a short rubber hose. You mixed your compound in the tank arsenic-based insecticides, lead arsenate, DET in its various commercial formulations, any of the contact herbicides sold over the counter at the garden supply through the 1950s, pumped it to pressure, and walked your rows applying a controlled mist to whatever needed killing. They were sold as professional equipment. A man who owned a good brass pump sprayer was a man who took his garden seriously. They lasted for decades. Fathers handed them to sons along with whatever was left in the chemical containers on the shelf. The early production versions had no pressure relief valve. A man who overpumped the tank, and overpumping was easy, because the resistance on the pump handle did not change significantly as pressure built toward the failure threshold could pressurize the tank beyond its rated tolerance. Tank failures were documented as ruptures and as seal ejections, both of which released pressurized liquid containing whatever compound the man had mixed into it directly onto his hands, his face, and his clothing. In the era of arsenic and lead arsenate, that was not a minor chemical exposure. It was acute poisoning through skin contact and inhalation of aerosolized material at close range. The EPA's phased prohibition of arsenic-based and lead-based pesticides through the 1970s and 1980s addressed the chemical end of that equation. The pressure relief valve became a standard design requirement under CPSC product safety guidance for portable pressurized containers. What could not be addressed retroactively was the cumulative exposure of the men who had operated those sprayers with those compounds every spring and summer for 30 years, and who were presenting to physicians decades later with conditions their doctors could not always trace back to a brass tank and a hand pump and a row of bean plants in 1955. Number 1. The gasoline-fueled flame weeder without a deadman valve. The flame weeder, a wand connected by a rubber hose to a pressurized gasoline or kerosene tank worn on the operator's back or mounted on a two-wheel cart, was sold as a serious piece of agricultural equipment for home garden use from the 1930s through the 1950s. The principle was sound. An open flame passed directly over a weed kills the cellular structure of the plant without pulling it, without chemical residue, and without disturbing the soil around the root of whatever you wanted to keep. Organic gardeners took to it before the term organic gardening existed as a marketing category. Men who had seen it used commercially on row crops and wanted the same result on their half-acre vegetable plot ordered them from the same catalogs that sold the seeds. They were not toys. They were professional tools marketed to serious home gardeners, and the men who bought them treated them accordingly. The early consumer versions had no dead man valve, no automatic shutoff that closed the fuel line when the operator released the wand handle. A man who stumbled, or set the wand down to move a rock, or lost his footing on a slope and dropped the wand with the valve open and the flame running had no mechanical system standing between that moment and a fire. Documented residential fires traced to flame weeders in this period involved fuel lines burning back toward the tank, dry mulch igniting from a set-down wand, and structural fires that started at the foundation of a house where a man had been working too close to the siding. Several involved the tank itself reaching a temperature that caused pressure failure while the operator was still wearing it. The tool was not banned outright. It was quietly redesigned by manufacturers who had read enough claims reports to understand what the valve omission was costing them, and the versions with automatic shutoffs that replaced the original design were safer in the specific way that mattered. The earlier versions stayed on the market through secondary sales and estate auctions for another 2 decades, passed from one man to the next with no documentation of what the design was missing, and no way for the new owner to know what he was carrying on his back.